So let's start with our first session. Just a very quick brush up on the way that our session works. Our session starts at 9:15. The first session is on understanding the adversaries. So at first, the two talks that we have on that session, they have 3 minutes to just brush up on the talk, review the talk, bring up a very brief description of the papers. So first we have Shah, and then we have Nidhi, Rastogi to present the papers. Once it's done, we open the floor for question and answers for both papers. So you can use chat, you can ask questions directly. If you're asking your question in the chat, I appreciate if you can actually mention which papers, or at least mention the name of the person that you want to ask the question. So this way, they can also look at the questions and get ready for it. So I think we have something like 2 minutes. If there's any question about the format, if there's any question about the way that you want to, go over the session, let me know. Otherwise, I'm moving the session to Neil for his presentation.
Thank you, Ali. I'm just going to share my screen quickly. Can everyone see this?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So hello, everyone, and good morning. So thank you for taking the time today to attend the talk. So my name is Shah, and today I'm going to give you a quick overview on some of the cool work that I did while at UC Berkeley, working alongside Grant Ho, my advisor David Wagner, and really a wonderful host of colleagues and collaborators from Barracuda Networks and Columbia University. And the work that I'll be presenting today focuses on understanding attacker activity in compromised enterprise accounts at scale. So really, at a high level, enterprise accounts are valuable and targeted, right? They're home to really large amounts and abundance of business information and functionality, right? Not to mention the sensitive enterprise emails that these accounts hold, right? So to kind of close the knowledge gap and really build better defenses against attackers in these accounts, we performed the first large-scale characterization of attacker activity within nearly 160 compromised enterprise accounts across over 100 organizations. And really, one of the big challenges that we faced at the start was when an attacker compromises one of these accounts, there's going to be a blend of account logins that are attributable to the attacker as well as the true user. So kind of the first contribution of our work was kind of devising a method really in the form of a rule set for really separating out and identifying these attacker login events and separating them out from the true user. So like kind of determining which account logins are coming from the attacker and which ones are coming for the true user. And once we were able to kind of devise this method to be able to kind of give us this analysis, we proceeded to answer some of the key questions we set out at the start. So one of the key questions we wanted to answer was, how long are attackers active in these enterprise accounts? And what we found is that attackers appear to maintain and really use access to these accounts for long periods of time. So in nearly 50% of the accounts, attackers are active for at least 1 day. And in almost 37% of the accounts, attackers are active for at least 1 week. So kind of now that we answered kind of how long are attackers active in these accounts, another key question we wanted to also look at was, what are the types of usage patterns that attackers exhibit in these accounts? And what we found is that in nearly 1/3 of the accounts, there's signs of multiple attackers. So namely, we see signs of where there's one set of attackers that kind of compromise accounts and then transfer credentials or sell credentials in some ways to another set of attackers that kind of use these accounts to extract value from these accounts. So, and actually in a majority of these 31% of accounts, the second set of attackers, the ones that actually use and extract value from the accounts, they actually utilize the accounts at a higher rate than the first. So kind of in combination with the fact that attackers are using these accounts for long periods of time and that there's possible signs of multiple attackers, we found that non-real-time detectors, so detectors that kind of operate after the initial compromise event, they can still remain valuable in a security team's line of defense, right? And they can still prevent a lot of and mitigate a lot of damage that might occur. prevent that from happening. So kind of in summary, there's a lot more results and details in our paper, such as kind of a more in-depth evaluation of our rule set, and trying to understand other findings related to attacker activity. So I encourage you, if you haven't, to check it out, and I'm happy to take any questions if you have any. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you very much for the brief presentation. The next talk that we have in this session is by Neil Rastogi, and it's on MALOnt, Ontology for Malware Threat Intelligence. It's the work that she did with her collaborators at RPI and also the IBM. So, Neil, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you. I hope you can see my screen now.
Yes.
Okay, great. All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Nidhi Rastogi, and this is the abbreviated version of the presentation on MALOnt. This is an ontology for malware threat intelligence. So gathering and analyzing malware threat intelligence is crucial for preventing and detecting future attacks. Why? Because they contain detailed account of evidence-based data from various sources about vulnerabilities and targeted actions taken to contain them. In this research, we are the first one to propose MALOnt, an open source ontology that represents malware threat intelligence and not just characteristics of malware. So we use ontologies which contain key concepts from a domain in the form of classes and their properties. What do we mean by properties? These would be the attributes of the classes and the relationship between each class. The advantage here is that both human and software agents can use an ontology to understand the structure of information that is stored in any unstructured, semi-structured, or unstructured information source like threat reports that we used for this research. MALOnt is open source, and it not only captures instances or facts about attacks, threats, and defenses against them, but also captures semantic information from threat reports. And that's the differentiating factor between MALOnt ontology and other pre-existing ontologies. So to learn more about how to design and develop an ontology, please refer to our paper. Requirements of the ontology that need to be defined with the help of competency questions are covered in the paper. And we also followed the middle-out approach, again explained in the paper, when building the ontology. So the ontology was used to annotate threat reports, and that I guess is something that most of you folks would be interested in. What did we do with the ontology? So it was used to annotate threat reports. We did several dozen of several dozen of annotated threat reports manually performed by our researchers. And I present an example here. So PowerPoint here is the name of the infected software, and therefore it is an instance of the name of the class software. The installs malicious code is an instance of the class vulnerability, and the relationship between the two are defined by the relationship has vulnerability. So several such instances eventually create a knowledge graph, such as this one that you see on the screen. A knowledge graph combines data from multiple reports and infers intelligence on instances. So followed by knowledge graph generation using an automation approach that we are currently working on. And what this is going to do is this is going to help us build a large enough knowledge graph that will contain triples for the annotated threat classes. And then we can apply machine learning algorithms on the knowledge graph to extract intelligence. Now I'd like to acknowledge my research collaborators and IBM who have supported this work. And I'm ready to take questions now.
Right. Thank you very much, Nidhi. Thanks a lot. And Neil, so from the audience, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask directly from the authors or in the chat. So one question for Neil. For page 12, I'm just reading it from the chat. So Why larger durations and time gaps is necessarily linked to multiple attackers? What if a single attacker changed their IP address intentionally to attack with more time gap and different activities to hide their activity fingerprint?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, Limon, and thanks for bringing that up. So kind of the larger duration and time gaps was kind of a way for us to kind of gain evidence for multiple attackers. But you bring up a really good point where if a single attacker changes their IP address to attack with more time gap and different activity. So one thing that was actually part of our evidence for not only just the larger time gaps and duration was we also in addition, we also studied kind of the difference in attacker activity kind of before the time gap and after the time gap. So if we saw that as well, like if it's a different IP address, right? Or if, for example, we use another feature called like a user agent, which is basically a way to kind of identify the device that's being used by the user or the attacker. So if there is a significant difference that we saw before and after the large time gaps, we would say that in that sense, it could be a sign of multiple attackers. Now, if a single attacker changes their IP address, it becomes a little bit more tricky, right? Because it could be the same attacker just from a different location. So we did have kind of a category of accounts in which we didn't know for sure if there were single attacker or multiple attackers. So namely for the multiple attackers, we had a sense for if we saw a significant amount of difference between attacker activity before and after the large time gaps, then we would say that it's more inclined to say it's multiple attackers. So if a single attacker changes their IP address, then it becomes a little bit more of a tricky situation. So in that case, we'd probably need to do a little bit more analysis to see for those cases.
All right, thank you. Question for Nidhi. How does MALOnt compares to Sticks?
Hi, Graham. Thank you for asking this question. This is something that we had to keep in mind. Sticks is a taxonomy. And what taxonomies do is they kind of create classes. If I were to use the same terminology as we did, they create classes, and then there would be instances for each class. But what is different from using a taxonomy versus an ontology is that there is a relationship between classes, and which differentiates using a taxonomy versus an ontology. The other thing is we are not just creating an ontology for the sake of it. We are creating a knowledge graph, which is the more important goal, and ontology is just a means to it. So by creating knowledge graphs, we will be able to create triples. And what triples are is there are two classes which are the entities, and there is a relationship between them. So what we are able to do once we have a knowledge graph is we are able to create embeddings, which can capture those graph structures of the knowledge graph. And once we have the embeddings, we can do a lot of machine learning. We can run a lot of machine learning algorithms on them, like clustering, classification, entity recognition, relationship recognition. We can even extend the knowledge, or we can even populate the larger knowledge graph from the training data set. So here we are focusing more on the goal, and ontology is a means to that.
Thank you. Another question for Nidhi. This is from Gangbang, and I add my part of the question on top of it as well. Is that have you considered how to analyze threat reports across different languages, if it's Spanish, Russian, English? And on top of that, do you also have dependency on the format that the report is written? It's because I've seen that each group has its own style of putting information over there. Would that affect your setup?
Right. So for the different languages, we only started with English. Obviously, in the future, it'll be nice to extend that to Spanish. But the thing is, it's important to also see in what languages are threat reports written and distributed across, different organizations. So we did take a look at some of the Chinese reports. We did see some English in that, but for now we are only focusing on English. This is very preliminary work. And then what was the other question was about the structure getting translated into the knowledge graph, the structure of the threat report getting translated into the knowledge graph. The answer to that is no. And that's the advantage of capturing the class and the relationship. It is independent of the structure of the report. However, what I would like to add here is that when we start creating embeddings of entire reports and not just classes and relationships, we will see how that impacts, what correlation do we see between the way the report has been written versus what kind of embedding that generates. So in the current format, it's a very small, like an atom, atomic, information that we have captured from the reports.
Great. All right, another question for Neil, and it's related to from Igor. The question is about the FPs and the false positive that you have. It's mentioned in your report as well. For the, we will have this discussion later in the panel today in the workshop, but what is the future work that you guys are considering in order to reduce the potential false positive for your research, in order for this thing to be reliable enough for the industry to put it actually in front of the, whoever that is using it as the line of defense for them to realize, hey, there's a compromise happened and they are dealing with these kind of issues?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And one thing I want to mention is kind of this rule set or method that we built was kind of a tool for us to leverage being able to kind of quickly separate out the true attacker activity and the user activity, and use that for understanding kind of these measurements about attacker activity. So it wasn't like a full-scale detector that our goal was to trying to be built out. Now, in terms of like future work that we could potentially do to add on, one is kind of one kind of possible line of work. So other than just looking at the IPs or user agents, we could also look at some timing patterns. So there's actually some previous work that has studied like kind of timing patterns and the typical times attackers kind of log into these accounts and try to understand it on that level. And kind of another challenge that we faced throughout our work also was the challenge of kind of getting really good ground truth labels for kind of sessions. So when attackers log in, we didn't have like the absolute like ground truth source for like, is this definitely an attacker session, or is this definitely like a true user session? So that could also help for building like a better and more robust detector for like future training.
Thank you. Another question for Nidhi, and this is from Liming. He's asking about the performance of the annotation tool that you are using, and what is the mechanism that you have to put, toward if it makes an error in your system.
Yes, so we are using BRAT annotation tool. You found that, that's correct. We did try other tools which were not really good for scaling up. So this annotation has been done manually so far, and we are supplementing BRAT. So BRAT, the output of BRAT annotation is an ATT file, ANN file, and we're kind of learning the structure of that ANN file to create Python code so that we can do some simple regex, or just identify similar or occurring terms and do what BRAT is doing, but do it faster. It is slow, I agree, because that's the nature of the tool, but we are only going to be using a very small a very small training data set. And on top of that, once we have created the knowledge graph from that data set, we will be using knowledge graph based embeddings to extend to basically create a larger knowledge graph from way more thousands and thousands of threat reports. Your question is how do you address if it fails to extract accurate information? So right now since it's been done manually, there is another person who's checking for accuracy. That's just the nature of manual annotation. Unless you have something interesting or useful to suggest, please, I welcome that.
Just a follow-up question on that. How big is your initial training data in order for you to become comfortable to use the ML thing to actually take over and continue generating information?
Yeah, that's a tricky question. I don't have an answer for that yet. We've only reached up to 100 annotated reports, and we hire more people to do that to reach more accuracy. But that's a trade-off that we we will come to an answer probably in the next research paper, but we don't have anything yet. Sorry.
Great. So I think one more question for Neil is comparison with other methods comparing to your techniques that you have used.
Yeah, so thank you, Qing Xing. Sorry if I butchered the name. So we actually didn't, so that's a great idea to try other additional ML-based methods. So we actually didn't get a chance to do that kind of in this work or kind of run a comparison. So definitely kind of for future work, we could try additional ML methods, such as maybe look at if we have a good way to kind of featureize the login events, maybe try some like an avenue of like deep learning, or maybe something in relation to random forests. But yeah, for the purpose of this work, we didn't have a chance to compare with other methods.
All right, great. And I have another question for Nidhi, and that's on the adoption and a larger scale adoption of the tool that they have. This is from Jaron Morris Mink. What are the design decisions that you have made in order for this thing to be larger scale, larger scale adopted?
Yes, so I think lack of any annotated data set, which exists in other domains, we don't have, at least I'm not aware of that yet, doesn't exist in cybersecurity. So this itself will be, as I mentioned, this is open source. So the annotations will be available to the community on GitHub. So obviously that was number one. And the other one was achieving large scale adoption. That was number one. And has this impacted the design decisions of the ontology? No, it hasn't impacted the design decisions of the ontology, because we included some ontologists, expert ontologists, who, which I think is useful to know, this information is useful to know, is to not have a very narrowly designed ontology, but to have a rather broader, but to rather have broader concepts defined in the ontology. But prior to that, prior to even deciding what the ontology is going to do, you need to be able to understand what the goals are for the ontology, and that comes by creating competency questions. So those competency questions should match directly to what the goals of the ontology are. And one of the goals is also large scale implementation of the knowledge graph. So those were the only considerations that we have made so far. Thank you.
Any other question? All right, great. Thank you very much, both authors, for the good presentation and answering the questions. Thank you very much for the audience to asking questions and participate. So we have a break until 9:45, and then we start. Ari would take over for the next session. So we would have break for maybe 10 minutes.
Thank you, Ali. Thank you, Guy.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Nidhi. Thank you.
Thank you, Ali. Thank you.